I used to think Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and other novels, was all about tea parties, ballroom dances, and polite conversation. But today's guest drew back that lacy curtain for me, revealing instead a witty author who partied, dined with spies, and rebelled against the status quo of Britain's Regency era. Welcome to Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. I'm your host, Pete Soroka, and each week we talk with the researchers behind the work, minus the jargon, and definitely minus the lab coat. In celebration of the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth on December 16th, we're joined by the woman rewriting Austen's legacy. Devoney Looser is Regents Professor of English at ASU and one of the world's most prominent Austen scholars, authoring or editing more than 12 books on her. In her latest book, Wild for Austen, Looser reveals a Jane Austen whose world was filled with scandal, war, and social upheaval, and how she turned it into stories that are still upending expectations more than 2 centuries later. Devoney, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pete. Great to be here.
So, you just released a new book, Wild for Austen, in which you set out to dispel some popular misconceptions of Jane Austen. How are you trying to reframe her for audiences?
I am looking at the ways that she deserves to be seen as wilder than she's traditionally been cast. Okay. I think there's this stereotype of her that she's sort of boring and quiet and sheltered, lived a small life, wrote about small things, and I think that's bunk. I think there are plenty of ways that she was wild for her time and remains wild for ours, and I want to try to bring those forward.
Okay, so how did she get that reputation as like quiet and proper and sheltered?
Well, I think we can probably blame or credit her relatives
and
the way that they cast her reputation in the earliest biographies.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things they said she never uttered a hasty, silly, or severe expression. That was one of the claims made. Okay, and that's clearly not true.
Very reserved.
Yeah, clearly not true. But they also said that easy will be the task of the mere biographer, that her life was very quiet and had few events, of little event. And so I'm definitely trying to show through legitimate historical evidence that that just isn't the case either.
So it was not an easy task for you as a biographer of Jane Austen.
Well, it's hard to find new things to say about Jane Austen, but there have been generations of critics and scholars trying to convince the public that she's wilder than they've been told and that we've been sold. So, I'm not saying anything terribly new with the larger claim.
Sure.
But I found lots of new evidence to support it that I'm really excited about.
So why did her family members cast her in this way? Was there some need to protect her legacy or the family?
Yeah, I think definitely. And part of it is that the novel in the early 19th century was not the high sort of well-respected genre that we think of it as today. It was seen a little bit like literature's trash. It was not the thing you wanted to brag that you were reading.
Right.
It was cool to read poetry or even drama, a lot of nonfiction, religious writings. Novels were seen as a little morally suspect.
Really?
Yeah. So odd to imagine.
Yeah.
And the reputation of a novel was changing in Jane Austen's era.
Uh-huh.
But there are ways that the family might have worried with a novelist writing in a genre that's already a little bit, déclassé, that she would get pulled along with it. So that was definitely part of what was going on. Women writers in particular faced a lot of discrimination and faced a lot of suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
The question was, if you were willing to put your ideas out in public, were you doing femininity right? Because to be appropriately feminine in this era was to make yourself smaller and to make yourself quieter. To actually raise your voice in print was already, to some degree, behaving in a wild manner.
Okay. So the genre itself, the novel itself, already a little bit risky, I guess. Not showing femininity in the right way, another layer to that. Was her work itself subversive enough to maybe warrant people, her relatives' desire to kind of frame her in a kindler light?
I think so.
Okay.
And, I don't think it was the most out there for its time. And I'm very careful to describe this as it deserves to be described in the book. She was not the wildest author of her day.
Okay.
And we might think of somebody like Mary Shelley or someone like the Bronte sisters and the ways that they did things that were not considered totally polite. Mary Shelley ran off to Europe with a married man and, wrote Frankenstein in this crazy castle. Jane Austen didn't do anything that was quite that outside of polite society.
Sure.
But the writings that she gave us definitely showed independent women refusing what they were told to do and celebrating that refusal.
Okay, so about her work. In your book, you measure each of her writings by how wild they are, and you land on Sense and Sensibility as her wildest. Can you tell me and our listeners how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to have debates with people. So I'm perfectly open to having a debate on this question. But it uses... Okay.
I defer to you.
All right, well, it uses the word wildest to describe one of the two heroines, Marianne.
Okay.
And I think that she is the character who lives on the edge and gets away with it, perhaps the most of any of the major 6 novels.
Sure.
And the ways that Marianne is wild have to do with her overly strong emotional life and her willingness to really put herself out there and just absolutely go beyond what's considered rational and okay and appropriate. She really is willing to push the envelope. And her sister Eleanor calls her on it.
Yeah. So what about male protagonists in some, no, maybe not protagonists, but other male characters in other books? Are there other through lines of wildness with them?
With the men.
Yeah, with the men.
I think a little bit less, interestingly. And partly these are stories that are told through the perspective of, or the narrator tells us through the minds of the heroines. She has some villains who are quite wild. But if you're asking about the heroes, I think in many cases the heroines are doing things that are more exciting and more subversive than many of her men.
No, I agree. The men often this is not a knock against Miss Austen, but the men take a back seat to the story. They're less proactive characters often.
Yeah, and it really depends which one we're talking about. Someone like Captain Wentworth of Persuasion is obviously very active,
right,
and has had a very interesting life. And the heroine of that novel, Anne Elliot, they're both in their later 20s, so they've had a lot more life experience. And she's very open with saying that he has had more life experience than she has. And it has to do with the kinds of opportunities that are open to single men versus single women in the day.
You also look at some of the wild aspects of her life itself, and how it may have informed her fiction. Can you tell me about some of the surprising or maybe lesser known things that you came across?
Yeah. So the Jane Austen biographical space is very saturated. People have looked into every little fact. So often what I'm taking are things that maybe only get a paragraph or a page in the biographies, but that when you dig into them, there's so much more there that tells us things about Austen's life and what she saw. And the wild adjacent people in her life suggest that she did not live a small life of no event.
Very colorful cast of characters.
Colorful, right?
Yeah.
She had an aunt who was accused of shoplifting, which was then a capital crime, so she could have been executed. She was ultimately acquitted. But what the chapter shows is all of the ways that this would have had an influence on Jane Austen herself, to be this close to a criminally accused aunt and to have a family that would have been dragged into what was actually a national scandal. There were end-of-the-year events for the year 1800 that said, yes, Napoleon, France invaded Egypt, and Mrs. Lee Parrott was acquitted of shoplifting. So, this was a really big story.
Yeah.
And I think the biographies haven't done a good enough job of showing just how big this would have been in the world Austen was inhabiting.
Surely shoplifting was not that uncommon.
Well, it was how much you took.
Okay.
And so over a very small amount to us, it would be classed as a capital crime. So in effect, like a major felony and not a misdemeanor, if we were using today's terms.
Right, but in the sense of how newsworthy it was.
So it was a wealthy woman who was being accused of stealing.
Got it. Okay, so it was Winona Ryder 200 years ago.
Thank you for knowing that reference. Yeah. I can't assume all readers in 2025 will know that reference, but yes, absolutely. Winona Ryder of her day.
Okay. And also she had a cousin, Eliza de Feuilly. Tell us about that, because I think that was my favorite chapter.
Thank you.
Reading through that one was the most interesting.
Yeah, she had a first cousin who was born in India raised partly in England and then very cosmopolitan European life. And there is much more that deserves to be said about her. I hope people want to read that chapter.
Yeah.
But she was really a witty and wild woman herself who said things like, flirtation is charming, it makes the blood circulate, and she said, I really despise using the word husband. She was very interested in her own liberty, and it's believed that she was probably an inspiration for many of Jane Austen's characters. Jane Austen knew her as a girl. Eliza married a French count, who was probably really a fake count and a fortune hunter.
I had never come across that noble title before.
Yes.
Comte?
He was a count.
Count.
Yeah. The Count de Foyde.
Yeah.
There were new noble titles being created in France in this time. People were joining nobility at the rate of almost dozens a day. I mean, it wasn't quite that large, but it was a lot.
Yeah. And I'm sure it was all legitimate, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons maybe the French Revolution was spurred along this. Anyway, so he was ultimately guillotined in the French Revolution. And Eliza then married one of Jane Austen's favorite brothers, Henry. So became not only her cousin, but her sister-in-law.
Right.
And obviously, she was an incredibly colorful character herself, but she introduced Jane Austen to many people in London when Jane Austen visited them who were quite incredible. And the chapter that I think it's my favorite after the shoplifting aunt is the international spy, the proto-James Bond that Jane Austen met through her cousin and sister-in-law, Eliza de Foyde.
De Armitage?
Okay, the Count d'Entraigues.
D'Entraigues. Oh, wow. Okay, I really messed that one
That's
up.
all right.
Yeah.
These French names are challenging.
They are, yeah.
And my pronunciation is by no means perfect.
So tell me about the research process to find some of these insights. As you said, the Jane Austen biographical space is super crowded. But these were previously only a paragraph or a sentence or so. What is the research process like to find some of these details that you're telling me right now?
I think we're in a really propitious moment for finding new things.
Okay.
And partly it's because a lot of the newspapers from the early 19th century have been newly digitized and made available for researchers.
Oh.
And sometimes they're in subscription databases. That is, they're not freely available on anybody's internet connection. But wonderful research libraries, like we have here at Arizona State, often have subscriptions to these newspaper databases. And one is able to go in and dig down and find things that haven't been previously noted or read, in some cases for hundreds of years. So I've coupled that kind of research with still going to the physical archive, finding things that are in handwriting. So I've learned paleography, which is the study of old handwriting, to be able to read these unpublished letters. And by coupling those newspaper reports with these unpublished letters, you can notice and find new things if you know what you're looking for. And I've been very fortunate in finding some new things.
That's so cool. It's like you're playing detective. You're putting the pieces together that haven't previously been uncovered.
Yes, and with old skills and new skills, old information and new information. I don't think we're at a point where you can have one without the other and find all there is.
Okay, you're an academic. You study literature as your profession. Getting that funded must be a little harder than getting some like cancer research funded, right? So can you tell me about some of the practical ways that literature and literature research can really benefit our lives?
Yes, you're right. There is not as much profit. And I think for many people, not as much obvious benefit for humanities research. But that's a shame because I think obviously if we consider the humanities the ways that we make sense of human experience, culture, societies, imagination, then knowing what happened in the past helps us understand who we are today and where we are going or might want to go next. So how could we ignore all of these things that make up the human experience across time, across nations, and across identities? I think we need to know more so that we're more thoughtful about who we are, who we've been, and where we're going.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot. I think. Look, I'm a journalism major. That's my background. I was not an English major. But stories are how we make sense of the world.
Yes.
Right. And even from a young age, like I have a young daughter, the way she relates to things is through stories, and I don't think that's a unique experience to her.
No.
Yeah.
No. And even what makes up the we, you know. Professors like to turn all statements into questions. I was talking about the we there. There is no easy answer to who belongs in that we. And I think even looking at that is an important question. How we conceive of ourselves as a collective, what makes a community. These are questions that haven't always been answered in exactly the same ways, right?
Speaking of questions, can you think of any particularly interesting questions that you've received from students about Austen's work or about your studies in general?
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite questions, and I do have a little section on this in the book and a chapter on Sanditon, which maybe some of your viewers, listeners will have heard of because there was a PBS story based on this unfinished last work of Jane Austen's from 1817. But I didn't generally teach it in the earliest years. And I did have a male student come into class once after having read parts of Pride and Prejudice and say to me, "Where are the carriage crashes? This is so boring. Nothing is happening." And he wanted Jane Austen and all of literature to be like Fast and Furious in print, you know? Yeah. So in fact, Sanditon opens with a carriage crash. And I thought this is actually a really perfect moment that I should be teaching and connecting for the students who want to know, what did it mean when vehicles came to a terrible end, or when people couldn't move even at 8 miles an hour, as was sort of the top speed in that moment for a carriage. So.
And that carriage crash is not like a death-defying stunt, right? It's just like kind of slowly topples over.
Well,
like
there is an injury.
Right.
There is an injury, and they're stuck because their vehicle is not able to be repaired for some weeks. So, I think, again, just to help students think about transportation, past and present, speed, past and present, were things that Jane Austen, too, could do. But I didn't realize that's what some of my students were hungering for. They wanted Jane Austen Fast and Furious.
I want Jane Austen on top of a carriage fighting like the Joker.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so the third part of your book, you look at her legacy. And kind of my big question coming away from that entire section was, why do you think her work has stood the test of time? I mean, you mentioned, the Bronte sisters earlier, who, famous in their own regard, but Jane Austen, another level. So why have her words been so persistent in culture?
I am not afraid to throw out a word like genius.
Okay.
So I think that's one reason.
Yeah.
I think she's just doing it better than other people did. But there were plenty of really smart people working on novels in the early 19th century. Some of them who were more famous than Jane Austen in her own day. What I think makes hers stand up is that they are incredibly rereadable.
Yeah.
You can find new things. I still find new things, having read every one of these more times than I can count. Opening a page, reading a line, seeing a phrase, and realizing this could really be dug into more deeply. There's more here. They're very funny. And I think people who come to them now love their comedy. They're romantic. There are love stories here. People like the happy endings. But I think, again, if you really know your history and you know your politics, you can see places where she's an incredible social critic. So I think the fact that you can read her on all of these levels, she's funny, she's heartwarming, she's moving, she's giving us some kind of happy endings that we like, but at the same time, she's showing us ways to see her culture and criticize her own day anew.
Yeah. Can you ballpark how many times you've read each of her books?
Oh my gosh! Again, when I'm teaching them, sometimes I have to be honest. I'm reading some sections more carefully than others.
Sure.
Don't tell all my students.
Yeah.
But I would bet I've read each of these maybe 50 times. How many semesters have I taught over 30 years?
Yeah.
Plus the times I've just picked them up because I was writing about one of them or because I wanted to. But I read them in snippets a lot now, or a chapter at a time, and I still get a great deal of pleasure out of that.
Okay. You touched a moment ago on knowing your history and your politics. I'm curious to talk about the period in which she lived. Tell me, what was Regency-era Great Britain like?
Yeah, and should I explain first why we call it Regency?
Sure, yes, that'd be great.
So 1811 to 1820 is known as the Regency in Great Britain because the prince served as regent.
Yep.
And he served as regent because his father was mentally disabled, was considered not competent to rule. And so although the king was still alive, King George III was considered mad. He was still alive, but his son, who eventually would become King George IV, took over as Prince Regent and ruled the nation during this period, 1811 to 1820. Many people will call all of the early 19th century the Regency, and I think kind of like the Victorian era can sometimes
Yeah.
take over more than 1837 to 1901.
Starts to stretch.
Yeah, the Regency can take over more. But 1811 to 1820, interestingly, coincides exactly when Jane Austen was publishing her novels.
Mm-hmm.
She died in 1817. Her last novels came out in 1818. So the idea that she would be associated with this era makes sense. The Regency was known as a time of excess. It was known as a time of war. Napoleon was taking France to war against England for a long period, but almost the entirety of that period, he was captured, he escaped. There were all, the war started, the war stopped. There were lots of things that Jane Austen would have lived and seen on a daily basis relating to war. But it was also the start of the Industrial Revolution, so incredible change in terms of employment and the economy. Some people call it a really interesting time for what's known as the longest revolution. It was a very interesting time for women's rights and roles.
Right.
So that was part of the background. And it was also some really significant changes in the history of enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
There was the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807.
Yeah.
Slavery itself was left intact in the colonies until 1833, but there was some movement at least to recognize that this was a bad thing, right? To put not too fine a point on it. So all of these kinds of change were part of her life. And meanwhile, the Prince Regent was driving the country into debt. He was a big fan of literature and novels, but he also liked to live very high.
Okay.
And there were, ways that it was a time of excess for some and real incredible change and poverty for others. And I think Jane Austen, as a middle-class woman, was right in the middle of these kinds of difficulties.
And you said 1811?
Yeah.
1811. So this is not long after the French Revolution. It's not long after the American Revolution. So
exactly.
That's all in the background as well. What is the popular conception of this period, what it looks like? Because what comes to mind for me is balls and exquisite manners and chaperones and all that kind of thing. Is that accurate? Is it more dynamic than we give it credit for? What is your take on that?
Yeah, and so pop culture has done a lot, and romance novels have done a lot to breathe new life into the Regency era. And I think there are many writers who get a lot spot on about that period. But there are also many who, as you're suggesting, show us the most glamorous, Hollywood-ready tip of the iceberg. And so I think the sense of what the Regency was has changed thanks to Bridgerton and Shonda Rhimes and trying to show the role of people of color in this period, which was absolutely accurate. But she definitely is interested in telling a certain kind of story, an uplifting story. And obviously, it was not all uplifting.
Mm-hmm.
Jane Austen stories, I think, they have happy endings. They were comic novels, plot spoiler, they all have happy endings. But she isn't afraid to show the things that are difficult, the kinds of economic conflict, the family conflict in particular, and the kinds of ways that lives can be lived on the edge and come up to and head over into what was considered the impolite world. The impolite world was very robust.
Yeah.
There was no shortage of things going on that are not the lead line in Jane Austen's version of what the world looked like. But they're there. She's not afraid to talk about the adulterers and the criminals. And especially, I think she's very interested in sexual predators and telling their stories without using that word.
Interesting. Can you give me a few examples of?
Well, I mean, in Pride and Prejudice, what is Wickham but a sexual predator, right?
Yeah.
He is looking for teenage girls with money to exploit. He is
That's gross.
Repeatedly doing this, and
Yeah.
we're shown him repeatedly doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an example where maybe we wouldn't Jane Austen didn't put that label on it.
Sure.
But I think we would put it on today, and it's deserved.
With a modern lens. Yeah, for sure. Okay. I want to talk about parallels between the social issues in Regency England and now. You mentioned a widening wealth disparity. What else was going on? I mean, I guess the Industrial Revolution, we're going through the AI revolution. But I don't want to answer the question for you. Can you tell me about some parallels we might be seeing now and then? Yeah,
well, I think, and you asked earlier, why did Austen survive?
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that she survived is because she's very interested in smart women and how women get access to ideas and books she herself is an example of somebody whose family allowed for that, right?
Yeah.
So although there wasn't formal women's education in this period, rich women could end up with tutors, and there were some kinds of finishing schools where girls were sent off to learn art and dancing and maybe some languages and maybe a little math so they could be household managers.
Mhm.
But the idea was you weren't supposed to learn too deeply. There was a belief that, in fact, if you got too smart as a woman, you could have an impact on your fertility. Like there were beliefs now that sound, out there to us because they are. But yeah, the idea was if you got too smart, not only would you not be attractive to a man, which would be, of course, the worst thing for a woman of a certain class, but that you could do damage to your reproductive system by
that
learning
makes
too
total
much.
sense to me. You're just like sucking all the energy out of reproductive organs into your brain.
So Jane Austen's family obviously didn't believe this.
Yeah.
Her father was a clergyman.
Mm-hmm.
For extra money, he ran out of his home a kind of a pupils' boarding school. He ran a boys' boarding school out of his home. And Jane Austen grew up being encouraged to read novels and literature,
Mm-hmm.
and alongside not only her brothers and her one sister, but alongside as many as 19 male pupils who cycled in and out of the house.
Right.
So she grew up in a very unusual environment for a girl.
Yeah.
But she was also encouraged, and her genius was encouraged by her parents.
You mentioned a few things there. Women gaining access to knowledge. What are some other topics do you think Jane Austen's novels can help us explore today and have helped us explore throughout history?
So one of the things that I tell my students that Jane Austen's novels do for me, or I think they do, is they show individuals how to lead a meaningful life in a world that's deeply unfair.
Mm.
I don't think these novels are a blueprint for how society should change.
Mm-hmm.
Jane Austen's novels raise a lot more questions than they answer. And I think that's by design. She doesn't set out to be overly didactic. And there were a lot of novels, a lot of books of all kinds from this period, where what they wanted to do was tell you how to behave. Kind of like today's self-help books, right?
Yeah.
Here's how you should do it. Here's how to maximize your potential. Her books were not that. Her books often in their endings have comic choices. It could be this or it could be this. And she leaves you thinking and laughing and wondering about what the right course of action would be. So I think rather than offering us necessarily a blueprint, she exposes features of her culture and asks us to trouble through them. Filial piety, being a dutiful son or daughter, definitely high among those kinds of ways that she's asking people to rethink choices and how to make choices. But she raises lots of questions about being a governess, for instance. So being employed in someone else's home to make the kids smarter. She makes connections between being a governess and being an enslaved person.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a common comparison of the time. But rather than telling us what to think, she asks us to think about it.
Interesting. So, okay, you said you've taught her books many, many times. Has writing this book and learning more about her, adventurous background affected the way that you read her work, the way you study it, and the way you're teaching it now?
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons that I came to this book, a little fun factoid about myself, is I've played roller derby in the past under the name Stone Cold Jane Austen.
Yep.
This is a part of my life that really helped me see how Austen's reputation was changing in popular culture.
Okay.
In the early 2010s, people would respond with shock when I told them I was skating under this Austen homage name. And after Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, the movie and the novel came out, there just seemed to be a little bit less surprise, more acceptance of connecting wild things with Austen. And that was really interesting to me too, and definitely prompted some of the writing that I ended up doing. But the more you dig into this question of wildness, you see how many people are still attached to the idea of Austen as mild. And I hope this book changes some minds.
Yeah.
It certainly, mine has been changed over the years as a result of how I've lived pop culture in the pop culture space for Jane Austen.
I mean, I'll admit that I had the preconceived notion of her as a very reserved human who wrote about not quaint things, but I guess I had her her family's narrative of who she was in my head before I started reading your book.
Yeah.
And even Stone Cold Jane Austen, it was like, oh, that's funny because it's incongruous, you know? That was my takeaway from it.
And I'm not saying she wasn't an introvert.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, most authors probably are, right? You have to spend a lot of hours with yourself and a pen on the page, or however we do it now with our fingers on the keyboard. And so, you know, I'm not saying that she was out there in the world doing the most extroverted things, but we've oversold the public on how quiet and sheltered she was. Way oversold.
I mean, you've convinced me. Back to literature in general. How has it been meaningful in your own life? I mean, you've made a living out of studying literature, Jane Austen in particular. But growing up, how was literature important to you, and how does it continue to be important to you today?
Yeah, so I'm a first-generation college student.
Okay.
My parents were both people who were interested in books, and there were books in our home. My mother probably, had she gone to college, should have been a teacher or a librarian. I mean, she was really very deeply interested in stories and the written word, and I credit her for starting me on the path to college. But she's also the person who put Jane Austen in front of me when I was 13 years old.
13, okay.
And the first couple of times I tried to read Pride and Prejudice, I just couldn't get into it. But my mom was kind of insistent and pushed this book at me. She knew I liked to read, and she wanted this one for me. And, you know, the third or so time, I kind of just clicked. I got what was funny. You know, Kitty's coughs or Mr. Bennet's snarky remarks in the first chapter. Like, it just got me, and I was hooked.
Yeah.
It was only many years later, I think after I finished my PhD in English literature, that I learned that my mother had never read Pride and Prejudice. And this blew my mind, and I was actually kind of mad.
Yeah.
But I learned to think of it differently when I realized that she chose it for me aspirationally. Like, Jane Austen as a figure came down to her as something that an educated girl should read.
Wow.
And she wanted me to be educated. So we think of Austen's novels as romantic aspiration or economic aspiration, but in my life, they were really about intellectual aspiration. And I'm incredibly grateful that my mom gave me this author and this gift that has really shaped almost my whole life.
That's really sweet, like, that she pushed on you in that way, because the whole time you're explaining that, I'm like, well, why would she get you to read it then? But no, that totally makes sense. Oh, that's like the nicest thing I've heard all day. So, okay, you read Pride and Prejudice when you were 13. It took a few times for you to get into it. Did the interest really click there? And when did you start studying her seriously? Was that in your master's program, undergraduate, PhD, what?
You know, when I arrived to college, first generation, everyone wants you to do something where you're going to make money. This is part of the family conversation, right? So I thought, well, maybe I'll do math, or maybe I'll do economics, or, you know, I wanted to do something that on the other end of it seemed like it would be a career.
Yeah.
But it wasn't what I loved. I loved English. And so I started out English in secondary ed. And one semester in a high school setting led me to realize that I'm not very good at policing a classroom. Or maybe I just wasn't good at inspiring high school students. But I had an undergraduate professor who taught me Jane Austen, who taught me the history of the novel and women's literature, who said you should go to graduate school. And so it's Professor Kathy Nickel who really got me started. And I got to see her last week.
Oh, that's great.
And to tell her, you know, how much she shaped my life for the better. So from there, I went directly on to graduate school, and it was the National Endowment for the Humanities that first made it possible, after I got my PhD, to travel to Great Britain for the first time. I got my PhD in British literature without having been there. It's an expensive trip, right?
Yeah.
But it was the NEH that made it possible for me to go learn how to use archives and, you know, to see the places that I'd been reading and teaching about for the first time. So thank you to our government and the NEH for opening that door.
That's important work. So, England, you went to England. Jane Austen's 250th birthday is coming up. What are you doing for her 250th birthday as one of the preeminent Austen scholars in the world?
The answer is I'm not entirely sure, but I hope I'm still talking to people about it. You know, I think, you know, my publisher would love it if I were having conversations like this one on that day, I think, very much. But if it turns out to be a quieter day than I'm expecting, I will certainly crack open Pride and Prejudice and read that first chapter aloud to anybody who's near me. So if you're near me, you're in trouble, because that's what we're doing.
Okay, well, Devoney, thank you so much for joining us today. Her book, Wild for Austen from St. Martin's Press. It came out in September. Get it wherever you get your books, preferably a local independent bookstore. That's my aside, not yours.
Good one.
Okay, good. It's endorsed then. This was a really fun read. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really interesting and engaging.
Thanks so much, Pete.
Thank you for tuning in to Lab Coat Optional. We are a production of the Strategic Marketing Communications team at Arizona State University's Knowledge Enterprise. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. If you found us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We are at the mercy of the mighty, fickle algorithms, and stuff like that helps people find the show. As always, lab coats are optional on this show, but we want to keep our researchers safe in the lab. So wear your PPE. Until next time, stay curious.